Welcome to Brain Cage, where we discuss BDSM, hypnosis, and the mind for all those exploring their fetishes and interests.
This is Puppet Master, your mentor for the podcast.
And this is Dracoso, your hypnotic guide. Aftercare is a very interesting topic, especially with the wide variety of methods people use to either deliver aftercare or to consider it. And I'd say, especially if we're going to be talking about aftercare, we're going to want to talk about the point leading up to it, which would be the end of a session. So when you're doing a hypnotic session, or even when you're doing BDSM, because aftercare is needed in both sections, that you want to start by figuring out how you're bringing the person out of the scene first. I've seen people do it very abruptly, where all they do is snap their fingers when it comes to hypnosis and tell them that they're awake, and it's very, very jarring. It's kind of like, well, imagine if you were parachuting down, you were getting close to the end, and at the last second someone just sort of cut the strings off the parachute and expected you to find a comfortable point to land. Some people get stuck in a tree, some people don't land easily, and this can lead to some pretty negative outcomes. So to me, I would say when it comes down to aftercare, the first thing to consider is bring the person out with as much thought as you did bring them in. It's, I guess, kind of along the lines of if you are being brought down into a state, you're being given guidance. It's like going on a mountain pass and being led up, or going on a hike, or even just exploring a new area and having a guide there showing you the pathway the first time. And then on the way back, it would be like saying, we're going to take this shortcut and just jump off, and we'll be right back at the starting. And the problem is that can be very discomforting. It can be very disregarding to some people. And so it's very important, both as the hypnotist, because of the fact that it can be very tiring. It can actually wear down on certain energy, and just especially because people who get very much into BDSM and into hypnosis, you can have a very strong response through adrenaline and through other means. And so understanding that aftercare is both for the person doing the hypnosis and the person being hypnotized, that the first thing you want to do is consider how well you are bringing the other person out and taking care of their returning trip, so to speak, as well as how well you're keeping track of yourself and where your energy levels are.
Often, hypnotist and dominant, subject, submissive, these words will be interchangeable. The philosophies of aftercare will be applicable to both sides of hypnosis and BDSM, because what's happening is one person is letting go and the other person is using their energies to monitor the situation and apply themselves onto the other person. So there's a lot of similarities there, and there are some things that apply a lot less with just hypnosis and apply a lot less when it's just BDSM.
True.
But we'll go over that, hopefully. Aftercare, I feel, starts as soon as the scene's over. And one thing I've seen a lot of the time is, in regards to ab reactions, even if the negotiation has been followed completely, sometimes people come out of it and have a bad reaction because everyone's mind works differently, and you'll never be completely in sync with the person one's working with. An example in BDSM would be the submissive that goes into subspace, just says yes to everything, and the dominant is very much the person that has to decide when the scene ends and when the scene should end. If they don't get that right, then the submissive can be pushed too far and need more looking after than they might do. That's not necessarily the dominant's fault. Because experience with a submissive will teach you how far you can take them and how long they can go on for, and that will change over time. And the most important thing to know is what to do for a person when it goes wrong. Because it doesn't matter how good you are, things can go wrong.
True.
It's just the way we are that one can never completely understand another person or even themselves. It's impossible. Which is why a lot of good dominance will be very much about the growth of their submissive and the growth of themselves and learning about each other.
I mean, it is always interesting to try and consider when we are talking about working together, about considering your own state and the person you're working with. There's so much variety. It's very hard in some ways to stop and question what is the right choice to make, what is the right thing to do. And I would say a lot of people over prepare or over focus themselves on how to respond. I've seen people who have tried to go through aftercare and try to give too much of themselves. For some people who just need time to calm down, they just need someone who is present. I've seen people who will go into an ab reaction. I've seen some of the worst ab reactions I could imagine. I've heard of ones that are worse, but I've seen some pretty bad ones. And in some situations, it's really just about understanding the underlying points. And that is that you are bringing a person out of one state or mindset. BDSM and hypnosis both. You are in a mindset during that, and that as the scene is coming to an end, you're trying to transition a person back to their original, if not a somewhat improved, where they've learned from the state, gained some pieces, or maybe even learned about themselves. You want them to return somewhat to a similar mind state as to what they started with. This allows them to have a consistency, like I mentioned before in this podcast, where you're coming up and going into an experience, and you're experiencing at the starting, you'd want to be brought back out in a way that also allows you to return back. And so both for someone who is being hypnotized or who is being in a scene of being controlled or in a BDSM scene, as well as the person who is controlling or hypnotizing, aftercare, in a very general sense, I would say really looks at, are you present for the other person if they need you? Are you allowing them to take the steps to get back into their original mindset? And especially if either you or the person you're working with are new to this, taking it slow is good. Especially when it comes to aftercare. Taking it slow, going gently, and understanding that things can happen. There will almost always be some kind of a hitch in any scene. No scene is truly perfect, but that's fine. That's what makes it unique. That's what makes the experience enjoyable. And the aftercare of it, when you're bringing them out, that uniqueness means that you should just be open to anything being possible. But it's good to support the idea that you're returning back to where you started. So giving support, giving the information they need, seeing it may not just be reversing what you've done. I mean, some people think that being brought into a trance just means the same thing as being brought out of a trance. And that's why some people may do it very quickly. And it makes you think of with an instant awakening, that could be similar to fractionation, another big topic. But in short, their mind is not fully back as it should be. And so with BDSM specifically, people can get very intense in a scene. They can have adrenaline running. Their mind gets very immersed in it. And so finding some way to calm down, making that bring them out a part of the scene rather than just an end point, and then creating the aftercare as a follow-up or even as a part of the after scene, quote unquote, that you are creating a pattern where they can come up and that they will be able to return. And then once they are out of the scene, that it feels like everything is back in a normal state. Anything left unsaid or undone can cause issues and can cause outcomes. And this will be different for every person that you may work with or that may be out there.
Not that there aren't useful tips that one can know when doing scenes. For example, if a scene's very physical, then afterwards a person can feel very cold as they calm down from it, and having a blanket to put around them can be excellent aftercare. When someone has been degraded, it's important to reaffirm that they are worth something, that you do care about them, so that their ego actually survives it. Otherwise, you can be causing some trauma, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
The psychology behind what we do in BDSM is really important to understand, and something that a lot of people coming into it might not even consider. Now, for hypnosis, the other day I had one of my subjects gain a little bit of control over themselves, as in I allowed them to do other things to themselves, and it's a bit complicated and I won't go into depth. They altered themselves to the point that when they said that they were happy to end the scene and they were finished with it, when I removed the triggers I put in place, they felt all weird and stuff, so I brought them back under. I used a metaphor of gently untying a knot so that everything was how it was before they'd knotted themselves up, and afterwards they felt fine. So as Dracoso is saying, it's all about returning them to a healthy state of normality, or an improved state of normality, depending on the goal and the growth that one has gained during the session.
True, and being able to connect and really understand, even as we're talking, I'm still thinking about, for example, my current partner. She and I love to do scenes, and one thing I notice is when we do very deep or very passionate scenes, even when I do our usual coming up out of this scene and going into aftercare, there are times where she still feels like she's in trance, still feels droppy or lightheaded, and so I may even do a second time bring them up. For key tips, especially when you're considering aftercare, because a lot of things can happen with aftercare, so it's hard to figure out with that variety what are main things that you should do or to prepare for it. And the main things, I would say, if you wanted 3 top ideas that came to mind as we've been talking, the first one is to understand the theory of mind. It's an idea in psychology especially that talks very much about the idea that we are aware that other people have minds, but also that they process and are aware of different things. And understanding that the mind experiences things so uniquely that each person's mind may be different, but understanding that and being aware of it helps us to prepare for what may be seen as the unknown. Some people I've known are very nervous when they do hypnosis because they're not sure they're going to do it well. I mean, like I mentioned in our first podcast, I had the cold shakes just when I was first doing it because I wasn't sure what I was doing. And understanding that there is no one formula or outline or description is a base point. It lets your mind be open to possibility. The second tip I would say, especially if you're doing this, is to try and shape the ending of any session as a way that gives clear points to the mind and the person that the scene is coming to an end. Not just an instant change, but instead, for BDSM, setting up different, say, restraints, setting up different activities, putting them into a certain position, or degrading them, you can use as points for bringing them back up. Such as if there was any equipment or rigging, one of the basic practices for ending a scene is having that rigging undone in a very similar way. Having them return to a point, and then physically, this is all physical points, putting them back in that point. For degrading, as Puppet said, was giving them that sense of value back, describing to them and making sure that they're aware that what happened in the scene was for the scene, and that there is a defining point where you begin bringing them and putting them back at a point where this is no longer the scene. The scene is meant to be enjoyed, explored, and if there are pieces of it that carry on, that's fine. That's something that you can enjoy and do together, but it's mainly about understanding that the scene is coming to a close. It's not just abruptly ending, it's not just a curtain dropping, there is a closing point to the scene. And so taking the time to understand what you did to get them there, and then taking your time to understand, well, what would be a way to bring them back from that? Just like following a path one direction, what would it look like going the other way? And that's a very big point, so that the person can return with you in a similar pattern. And the third tip I would say especially is being prepared for anything to happen. I think the simple way to put it is, on a very, very low scale, you could expect nothing. They'll wake up, they'll feel relaxed, they'll feel comfortable, they'll have enjoyed it. It was a scene or it was a hypnotic session that they felt went well, and they enjoyed it. And you can talk with them and support them. On the other end of that scale, you could have someone who has an abreaction and has a panic attack. They may have negative points. This isn't to scare you. This is simply to give you an idea of, if someone has a strong, sudden negative reaction, the main thing to do is to be present, to be there, and to understand beforehand with negotiation. If they've never experienced an abreaction or they've never had that ending point, that's fine. It's about communicating with them to understand what are things that they would find helpful if they were in an uncomfortable situation. Do they prefer being further or closer? Do they feel like you being a resource at the time will help? And if not, who would be someone who should be there? Or communicating, pretty much trying to understand, if this situation went well, what can you do? If the situation didn't go well, what are your resources? What are your options? And that's why, like Puppet mentioned earlier, having something like a blanket ready, having an item, an object nearby, something they can use. I knew one person who, when they had a negative experience, they came out of it, they were very angry, not at the person, just a general anger. And so the hypnotist handed them a pillow and they beat the living daylight out of it. And it helped. It's different outcomes, but it's always good to know what you have in hand and just to assess, what is it that's nearby that might be useful, or what is it that you might need that even you would feel comfortable having to know that you can use.
I think, given that you can't know everything, it can be a good idea to talk to people that have a lot more experience than you in what you're going to do, to know the kind of things you might expect. So if you're starting off, this is a really important thing, is finding people more experienced than you and talking to them, or looking online for that information, because people talk about BDSM everywhere. If you look for it, you'll find it. And one of the things that people do miss, though, is that aftercare doesn't really stop. It stops when the person no longer needs it. But there's a thing called aftermath care, which is basically the recognition that someone might need to be checked in on the day after, a month after, dependent on the person, dependent on how extreme the thing you're doing is. You'll want to agree times that you'll be checking in on them. And some experienced subs will be like, no, I don't want you to do that. Don't waste your time. It can be a good thing to negotiate that you will be checking in on them the day after as well. It can be very, very important for a person because they'll have processed a lot of it while they've slept. And so aftercare doesn't just stop at the end of the day.
True. Yeah, aftercare is an ongoing situation. I think, like we said, it's about bringing them back to that mental state where they are able to return to, if not the same point they started, but a similar one with more knowledge, more experience, and more information now that they've gone through the scene. And there is no time limit for how long that may take. I think checking in, since, as well, we've covered a lot so far we've talked today, is that the mind is not one that we can look at from externally and understand it in its entirety. We can't analyze every piece of it and know what is happening and going on. We can only get a very rough estimate. And so questioning whether or not that person is fully back to normal is, I can't say that it's not a good use of time, but I can say that in a way, there's a certain point where it becomes a use of energy that would be better applied to just understanding how to connect with that person to make sure that they are in a good state of well-being. And the difference being, a person who comes into you, or comes in to see you, I should say, and is trying to relax, trying to explore, wants to enjoy a possibly intense scene, once it ends, hypnosis should be something that allows the person to return back to that mentality where they can now say, I've experienced this, and I would like to move on to explore either in a different way, or explore it again, or just be able to make these decisions again. In a way, you can say that it is important for a person's mind to always be aware of itself. And at some points during hypnosis, the mind is not fully aware. For some people, it may be constantly monitoring, but when you bring them back up, there may be parts that they were not fully aware of, their mind was not fully counterbalanced or aware of. And for me, one thing that I love to use with people, especially people who want to remember or feel more comfortable, is, and I have no idea where the idea came from, but it was a string attached to the pinky. A string that goes, and since people use depth, as we mentioned in the past podcast, that depth is an idea of going deeper and further. Some people take that very literally and imagine themselves going deeper. And so I imagine it being a string that I've described as being attached to the pinky that goes right up to the surface. And if they're worried about memories, it connects to pieces of the session that get caught in the string that as they come back up, it comes with them. And this is a method that they allow themselves to be more comfortable because now there is something that is monitoring that they don't have to be the only one in control of. And it creates a connection between us, but it creates a safety and a security. It creates this ability for them to come back up out of the state and be able to take back all the things they need. And so it also gives them an ability that if you do bring them up, let's say for some reason there's an emergency, there's a sudden point, or there's an interruption, you can put in fail-safes like this that allow them to come back up safely and securely and have more intact. The main thing is that, I guess this is probably a big thing, it just came to mind, is a person's mind, even though we cannot truly understand ourselves in our entirety, we all have an understanding and a deep reflection of who we are and how we are. And we understand that better than anyone else. If someone else is guiding us and bringing us down inside, and they try to bring us back up, and there's something left behind, the only person that may be aware of that is the person who's being hypnotized. And the person in the scene, if it's BDSM, they may be the only one who is truly understanding how that scene is affecting them internally. So creating systems, I think, again, going back to our topic of being vague that we've had before, creating methods, because when things are very various, outcomes may not be sure. Having a way to describe a vague point, like returning back to normal, returning back to your original mind, having this string that will connect to pieces that your mind sees as important, or that may be a very strong driving force for how to return back to normal. Giving these outlines that leave vague points so that the mind can keep itself connected without being told, keep track of every single little piece in detail, can really help to bring a person back up out of that state and can really connect them back to where they were when they started.
So have you ever had any particularly strange forms of aftercare that you've had to give?
Yeah, the one with the pillow and the anger was a friend with a different hypnotist. I can say I've never had an ab reaction, which is still very strange to me because of the fact that I've worked with many different people in different formats, and it makes me think of we should probably discuss Aftercare at a distance, because I do a lot online as well.
Me too.
No, yeah. And for odd reactions, I've had one person who I would bring up out of trance, and they wouldn't remember anything, nothing would have stuck, and it would be almost as if they hadn't have even had a trance. And when I'd offer them aftercare to do things, the only thing they would tell me is that they would have a soft headache in the back of their head. And it was, in a way, it was very strange because I've known aftercare to be very focused on how do you help someone with calming down, with either, as you were saying, if they might need a blanket,
Or a massage.
Or a massage. I've known a few people that get sore because their body tenses up because of doing hypnosis. It makes their body more active while their mind is less active. One person, like I said, they would just get a small headache, and I'd be so confused by why this was the case. And it would make it so that even though one of their main goals was to have a trigger that would let them instantly go back under, we'd always have to do a full induction. Even when I tried to reduce the inductions, they weren't working. So I'd have to do a full timed induction, about 10 to 15 minutes roughly. And eventually I figured out, after exploring with them, that it was a part of their brain. For some reason, when they went under, they were tracking themselves, but in a way where, and this took a little while, they actually believed subconsciously that being hypnotized subconsciously was correct. They wanted to do it. They loved it. They enjoyed doing it. Subconsciously, they thought that by being hypnotized, they were giving up control, which was putting them in danger because they were no longer in control and they couldn't make choices. And so their subconscious was reading it as an uncomfortable situation, even though their conscious was saying it's comfortable. And that disconnect really threw me for a loop for a while. And I sat down and we had a full discussion, and we realized that I talked to them and I asked, why would you feel unsafe? And they said it's because they didn't know what was going to happen. And even though we were negotiating and discussing what would happen, their minds still didn't connect with the idea that this was something that was fully laid out for them. They thought that there were still going to be unseen points, and it's that sense of a loss of trust and comfort and the feeling that something terrible might happen. We talked, there was some history, and we discussed it, and eventually we found that their mind was doing it because of a specific person, or actually two people, but because of that, we went in, and the next time we did hypnosis, of course it wasn't an immediate light switch where, oh, everything works perfectly. Now, they were now far more comfortable. The hypnosis worked, and the main aftercare they needed, they actually broke down crying, but the main aftercare they needed was support, talking, and it felt similar to the, God, what is it called? The scene where they had Matt Damon and Robin Williams and Good Will Hunting. There we go. In Good Will Hunting, where one of them is breaking down crying and realizing that it's not their fault. And so it became a very interesting scene of this person where at the starting there was nothing, and it was because they didn't feel safe and comfortable, and finally reaching that point where they could be after a long talk, and it being a complete flip where they now needed a lot of aftercare. And that change was so sudden. But in a lot of ways, it shows that the mind itself creates the outline of what may happen and what it's expecting, and all the tense points. It's kind of like, imagine when you tense your fist up, and you feel that tension, and if you hold it for just long enough, after a while, it becomes natural. It becomes normal, and then when you finally release it, you can feel the stress, the relief. But imagine that emotionally, and psychologically, and physically. And that can be a point that comes after being released, showing them how to release that tension more openly and fully, which may come with time and practice, or it may just come with good discussion, is very important, in my opinion.
Aftercare can change for people over time, and the longer you work with someone, the better you'll be at it for them in the long run. I have a sub that, to begin with, the aftercare ended up being more sexual activity. That's what they needed. But then it shifted as I got to know them more to being, particularly with hypnosis, to let them ride it out until they are satisfied and have felt the effects and have calmed down during the effects of the hypnotic session. And that gave them what they needed. So rather than ending the session myself, I let them end the session when they were ready to. So I chose that it was going to end because we'd finished, and then they chose a satisfying point in time at which the effects of the session hypnotically would end, which was interesting. So that's just an example of how communication and knowing a subject or submissive for a long period of time, things can change, and you'll change the way you do things around a person. And it's important to try to avoid getting into a pattern too much and communicating and adapting, even if it's small things or big things, and trying new things out. And if it doesn't work, then you can always go back to the old things. That's fine.
Yeah. I mean, it's like we talked about a bit in our second podcast, the idea that you don't want to create just a one outline that you try to press into the belief, both for going in or coming out. It's about being fluid in the situation, allowing yourself to be open to responding. And I think the mentality especially is that if you want to be prepared for any outcome, for any point that may come from it, is to be aware of that, one, making sure that you are able to keep yourself in a state where you can make choices as you need to. So being in control of yourself to some degree and being able to respond and be aware and open-minded, especially. That you are trying to respond to anything that might happen, good or bad, and that being flexible is the best way you can keep yourself ready to respond to anything that might come up. I'd say, especially with this, comes down to the idea of if you're working with someone remotely, the choices on what you can do, both being in person versus being on, just say, on a voice call or being on a video call with someone, you may not be able to pick up on as many of the signs or as many of the pieces, but understanding that if you're working remotely or working at a distance and you're doing hypnosis and you're doing possibly BDSM, such as degradation, understanding the point at which your control, your influence, pretty much what you're doing can affect a person may not be as physical as it could be if you were face to face, but psychologically and emotional, it can immerse someone so fully that working from a distance, it's good to be a bit more careful than if you're there in person because you have fewer options. It's also good to be aware that when you're working with them, it is far more psychological, and so creating more of a psychological response, such as if someone breaks down crying, knowing what gets their attention, focuses them, and knowing how to calm them, such as discussing and saying if they feel upset afterwards, because with degradation, let's say it's very enjoyable in the moment, but afterwards it makes them feel worth less than they are. Understanding what things that they do, like what are achievements they've done, what are things that they are proud of, and what are things that they feel like with you personally are valuable or important. And you can use these points, especially working from a distance. If you're going to explore, I say working, I should say exploring. If you're exploring and you're at a distance from someone, you're miles apart, maybe even a whole country apart, the biggest thing is to understand that our minds are still processing and working, and so the more that you have that you can give them to work with, especially in the sense of aftercare, where you can actually talk with them, give them this sense of returning back to a point of normality or a sense of comfort, a sense of security, even if you're not there physically feeling like you are. Asking them, what would it feel like if I was there and giving you comfort? What would it look like or feel like is one way you can ask. And if they don't have an answer to that, that's fine. Describe a few things that you think would help. Build with them what you think might help. And I think that's a big thing too, is not just building up your repertoire and your ability to trans or to explore with BDSM in all different forms. It's really building up that connection and understanding and just spending the time discussing with them. What if this happened? What if I did this? How does it make you feel? And finding the yeses and the nos creates a more safe and secure pattern. It creates a pattern that you can change and flex. And it creates an ability for you to actually talk and find that outcome that you're looking for, and helps you to deal with ones that you may not want, but to really bend it in a way that you would find effective and valuable to both of you. I know one experience I had, which was a very unique one, was someone who I explored with for a few months, and she was very big into taxidermy, and she found the comfort of it being this sort of natural resting point with these animals. And so one time I actually was working with her, and she was having a bit of a negative reaction. She was feeling off balance, like she wasn't fully back to herself. And so I just had her focus on that sense of what she enjoys about taxidermy and just had her relax into that pattern. It's a natural point she had. I mean, have you ever had an experience like that before, Puppet?
Kind of. I got a subject to imagine a calming place, a nice place. It had a forest and it had a river, and as part of Aftercare, because I couldn't be there in person, it was actually useful to use hypnosis to take them to a place that they were safe and comfortable in their mind, and use that to give them a space to calm down and recenter themselves.
Like a mindscape, right?
Yes, exactly.
Right.
One of the things you wanted to cover that I don't have a lot of experience in is self-aftercare, or aftercare that a submissive can give the dominant, because sometimes dominants need aftercare too.
Mm-hmm. And so the first thing to understand especially is when you're in a scene, both BDSM and hypnosis, you become as engaged or immersed as you feel comfortable. And I should say we get very engaged, we can get very worked up, and we can get adrenaline running. It uses energy, it uses time, and so we are actually putting ourselves into a state where we also can get worked out. And so understanding that our mind, we are understanding the steps that we're taking and returning from them, but at the same time, a hypnotist, especially new hypnotists who may be nervous or anxious, may need a lot of aftercare as well. And as you get more experience with it, you may learn the balances, but at times, if there are situations such as things happen, there are reactions that are not expected, a hypnotist can also have similar, possibly not the exact same, but similar responses and workings that can happen. I've only ever heard of one hypnotist who had an abreaction, and it was very unique of a situation. But the hypnotist was trying to trans two women that were actually sisters, and in his mind he had originally thought that one of them would react similarly or identically to the other because they were very similar in nature, behavior, personality, right? It's a basic fallacy. We're all different, we're all unique, but he was expecting that the hypnosis would work in similar ways, and the problem was they were responding to some things very similar, to some things in almost opposite respects, asking if they were comfortable with certain things, trying to use a trigger and having them respond in certain ways. And for example, at least again, this is secondhand, so I wasn't there to witness it, but the one person they were both told at the same time to act like an animal. One of them did it in a very subtle way, where they were simply in the same position. The other one became full-bodied and moved and actually acted like it. And this now creates two separate scenarios to have to respond to. And so he had to fully engage with the one that was moving around and bring her back and relax her, and then take care of the other one as well and make sure that they were at the same point. And it's sort of like, imagine two bars that are rising and lowering, that can go up and down, and imagine one jumping up and the other one staying where it is and having to keep them at an even level. And he did this for so long that I think it was supposed to be about 15-20 minutes because he was still trying to get the goal that they originally made intact. When it ended and he brought them out, he actually had an abreaction because one of them came up feeling uncomfortable because of something. The one that had actually been more calm and less responsive came up feeling uncomfortable because there were gaps where he had to deal with the other sister. And the other sister felt very turned on and very engaged. And he had an abreaction because he was someone who very much wanted to help and take care of both of them, keep them at an even level. And now he had one girl who was upset and frustrated because she was very turned on and wanted to be very sexual and playful, and the other sister who was very uncomfortable and needed a different attention. And because of that, it caused a split in mentality. And it caused the mind to figure out how to balance it. And a very experienced hypnotist may have known how to keep it balanced or found some way to maybe bring them out and discuss it again. But because of how this played out, they ended up having a very strong panic attack and needing to pull away and needing to actually calm down. And it can go to show that if a hypnotist gets too, maybe not too immersed is the way I'm going to put it, if a hypnotist does not take care of themselves as well, and make sure to take time to understand themselves and how they can deal with situations, it can be very immersive as well. It can possibly even lead to having negative experiences and even somewhat traumatic ones. Some of the simpler ones would be people going through the session, bring them out, and then, like I mentioned earlier, having the person who had no response, no aftermath of any working, nothing really was connected. And it was disappointing to some degree because I was still in the first few years of my exploration, and so it felt like I had failed in some ways. And so sitting down and realizing that failure in some ways was good, but in some ways it also just meant that there was more to do. And instead of sitting back and thinking, I'm the one in control, so I have to be doing everything, and it's really about looking at it as we're both the person who is hypnotizing and the person being hypnotized, or the person in control of the scene and the person who is being controlled, however you want to divide it. Both people, or even more than both people if there's multiple people, everyone in that scenario is an agent or a being that has influence and actions. And by doing so, the people are engaging, they're using energy, they're engaging who and what they are. And so when it's all over, making sure that you are where you started, that you are able to recover, and that even as a hypnotist, it's important to take care to remember that you are getting just as immersed as the person that's being hypnotized, if not more, because you have to be actively doing things rather than being a person who is guided or maybe interacting. You do a lot more creation work, and a lot more mental energy may be spent just through acting and doing, and acting as in taking action, not acting as in pretending. But it's important, especially as a hypnotist, to remember that when you become engaged in this activity, or as a dominant, when you are doing these scenes, to remember to check in with yourself as well. If you are not checking in with yourself and it's a long scene, I've known some hypnotists that are exhausted by the end of it, or they are dehydrated or having headaches because of it. I've known hypnotists who try to do things very intense very quickly, and when it doesn't work out, they take it very personally to themselves. They blame themselves. And so it's really about understanding that you are coming into this with expectations, but also that you are coming into this with a certain level of ability and capability, and that you're a person as well. Just like the person you're hypnotizing, taking care of them because you're the one guiding them, taking care of both of you is important. If I had to say a priority, I'd say taking care of the person that's being hypnotized or controlled, because they've opened themselves up and may be in a position where they don't have as much control to return back to their own mentality, but also weighing and taking care of yourself as well, and making sure that there is time to do so, to both understand yourself better, as well as just to create a safe environment, because if you aren't in good shape to be able to take care of yourself, you're probably not going to be in good shape to take care of the other person.
It can help to talk to them about anything that you might need in negotiation from the dominant side as well. I think the worst thing that's happened to me is at the start I was practicing so much with so many people that my voice started to go. When things didn't go well, it was kind of a challenge, and I would talk with them about it. I would talk with more experienced hypnotists about it, and then we'd try again. I never got down about it, because for me it's always been a learning process, and failure I'm from a scientific background. Failure just means that we need to readjust what our expectations are of things. And that's exciting for me.
Right.
That's my take on it. I do understand that it can take a lot of energy being the hypnotist, because you're constantly thinking and constantly looking for reactions, and you're trying to imagine what they're experiencing, and it can take a lot of energy to do that, and it can feel quite draining afterwards, but often in a good way, I think. It depends how much you push yourself.
Yeah. I mean, and even touching back on that state of flow, even though you can be perfectly immersed in it, where your level of skill matches the challenge, it does take a lot out of people. I mean, you can see at the end of master violinists who play and become so immersed in it they can play for hours. At the end of it, they're exhausted sometimes. They can be sweating and worn down, and being in that scene, in that scenario, in that mindset especially, can make you disregard certain things. It'll make you disconnect from points of what is going on. And so knowing the things that you may, or thinking about the things you may need to prepare for, like drinking water is a basic that people have in all scenes. Don't dehydrate yourself when you're doing anything, because dehydration is terrible and very dangerous. You know, making sure that when you're doing hypnosis or when you're doing a BDSM scene, making sure that the person can communicate with you if something is going wrong is very important. And this leads into aftercare, especially because feeling like there is safety and security for both people during the scene can affect the outcome of whether or not they feel like the scene is actually over. They can feel like whether or not they'll actually be comfortable the next time they do it, and whether or not they are able to immerse themselves fully, or if they were so worried during the scene that when it's over, it may all come out at once. So I'd say checking in is a big aspect people talk about, being able to check in often, and it can come in so many different forms. The verbal check-in is the base. That is probably one of the most basic things people do, and rely on is checking and saying, is everything okay? That's a very basic way to ask. Some people use light systems, where they'll use green, as in things are good, go on. They'll use yellow, as in pause, there's something we need to address. Or red, as in I want this to stop. Or people who use orange would say there's an issue that we have to deal with, and we cannot go on until you say otherwise. And it creates a more complex ability to give information. It could be as simple or as complex as you want, but I would usually suggest, from my own experience, is that for check-ins, having different check-ins, such as even keeping eye contact, is a form of check-in. If you're able to see their eyes and see how they're responding, especially because in some situations where if their partner is gagged or if they're unable to move, having some kind of a check-in system where they can give information back, which in the end will give you more aftercare knowledge.
Having them hold something and drop it if they need the scene to pause or stop.
Right. I mean, I knew one person who was very creative with it, where they would have a glove. If you ever seen, kind of like Iron Man or different movies where they'll have, the glove will have sort of little pieces you can press on. There's a high-tech individual I knew who could reach in and actually touch their palm, and they would have 4 buttons, which if they gripped normally, it would have no effect. Like, it would not activate anything. But if they pressed on any of these buttons, which would be pinky, because it's supposed to have the least control, as they explained it to me, and then index finger has the most control, they actually had a system where they could press those buttons, and it would tell them what was going on. So if anything was wrong, they could press the button, and it would actually make a verbal noise, such as, well, I think for them, they used the light system, which was why there was an orange. And they would just press it, and it would say the color, and immediately the person who was running it would respond to it. That way they could be gagged, they could be held down and enjoying it, but they'd have an emergency system to work with in case something came up. So
that's cool.
Oh yeah. Having a creative solution is a very unique way to do it. I mean, I remember we were trying to create safe words, ones that would be unique. And I remember, I think mine was pineapple. And it was partially a bratty joke, but partially serious. The bratty joke was because I knew so many people who hated pineapple on pizza. and they would just say the moment they saw pineapple on pizza, they didn't want to have anything to do with it. So that was my safe word to stop. And then the serious part of it was the fact that back when I had been in Hawaii, because I lived in Hawaii for a little while, we actually had a very, very negative story someone told once. I won't go into detail, because it's a little graphic, but it's a long story short, it was a story about a pineapple being put someplace it shouldn't. Ooh. So that's why pineapple was absolutely my stop. Yeah, that was my, no, we're not going there. But yeah. So, especially understanding that the flow of the session can impact aftercare and what they need. The biggest thing, I guess the most important idea, if you take anything away from this whole discussion, from my perspective, the most important thing to consider in aftercare is that when a scene is coming to a close, you want it to be fluid, you want it to have as much thought as starting and running the scene, and you would want the person to end in a similar point to which they started, to where they are back in the sense of control they had originally, and that you are being a guide from start to finish, and that once you get to the end, it's just as important that you check in and discuss with them what's going on as when you first started. Because if negotiation is a point where you begin planning, aftercare should be the point where you are helping them to return to the point where they could do negotiation comfortably again.
And planning for that can be very important too. In a lot of BDSM clubs, they'll have sweets and lollipops about. Because after a scene, your energy levels just drop.
Mm-hmm.
And so having something that can pick you up while you're recovering can be really useful. And the same's true with hypnosis. After a session in which a lot of energy has been spent, having something sweet can be really useful for either side. And as a hypnotist, as the one in the more dominant position, I always tell my subject, have some water nearby before we start. And if you have something sweet or even savory, something you can snack on afterwards, that'll be very positive as well.
Oh, yeah.
So planning ahead, I think, is very important as well.
Mm-hmm. Definitely brings to mind when I've gone and given blood, actually. It makes you think of at the end of that where they give you the little snack bags and some water to drink and just the taking care of yourself. I mean, there's a lot of different things you can do, especially since you know your body and your mind better than most and how you may respond to a negative scenario. So it's good just to sit down and do some prep work. I mean, on top of the getting some water and a snack to start, I usually also direct people just to use the restroom and get comfortable so that their body is at a point where it won't have to respond to anything too immediately afterwards.
One situation, it didn't require a lot of aftercare, but it might have done. I was hypnotizing someone for the first time, and she was like, I need you to wake me up.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh, that's a very good subject to be able to respond to that. So as I was slowly bringing them up, because I didn't want to rush things, as she got closer and closer to consciousness, she then sits up very fast because she got to a break point where she was reacting to the reason why she needed to get up, and that was because she just put too many covers over herself, and so she was overheating. But she sits up, bangs her head.
Oh! Wait, what did she bang her head on?
I think she had like a shelf above her or something.
Oh, might have been a bunk bed. Ooh.
I don't know, but it was really funny. Like, we laughed about it afterwards. It didn't need a lot of aftercare.
Oh my gosh.
Other than her own looking after the bump on her head.
Yeah, that was, I had a similar experience, except for it's the reason why I have people, use the restroom before we start. Somebody has to be woken up. And I brought her up and I was like, are you okay? Is anything wrong? And she's like, I just really need to pee. And she threw her headset off and ran.
Mm.
So it's good. I would say, I don't think you'd ever call it pre-care, but pretty much just, the preemptive and understanding the before and the after. are just as important as the during. Can be very, very important.
There's times when you're with an experienced subject and they interrupt the session for one reason or another, subconsciously. It's fun. Funny, I mean. Fun to think back on.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, and I know your cats like to jump up and be a part of our podcast involuntarily on occasion. I had one person who was doing a very, very erotic scene, and her puppy ran in. It's the best interruption, no sarcasm at all, for a very hot and heavy scene where the puppy runs in, jumps on the bed, and starts licking her face.
Hot.
But 15 seconds later, that session was over. Aftercare was calming her down from her rage at the puppy.
My cats were meowing once during an induction, and afterwards I was talking over what their experience of it, what parts they remember, just kind of trying to understand them as a subject, and they said the only parts of the induction that they can remember are the meows.
Oh my gosh. It sounds perfect. Guess what? We have cats near your induction.
I hope that was an intentional pun.
Which one?
Perfect.
Oh no, that was not. Oh my god.
I mean, now that I look at it, having cats meowing in the background probably acts as a very good distraction. And I know later on I've even worked it into the induction as this kind of ignore the sounds that you might hear, like my cat's meowing.
Just ignore the sound of that truck backing up into my driveway.
Yeah. And if you tell them to ignore it and they're in the flow of it, it can work. It can just be adaptable.
Oh yeah. And I mean, I've had even the smallest things that can cause an off-rupt. When I say off-rupt, I mean it can cause an interruption that's off base, which was, I remember I did a countdown in the past, I used to do a countdown which was counting from 100 to 1, and that was the induction. And the whole focus was how you said it and how well you said it. I had somebody who pointed out that when I say S's, I actually have a very heavy focus on them, and I'll actually do like a tongue, the snake effect, where you're like 6 and like a slide, and that threw them off so much that I realized in my aftercare, one person I actually did it with was very uncomfortable, and it made a lot of sense because all of a sudden I was like, oh yeah, this person is uncomfortable with snakes at all times. I should probably focus on that. So the aftercare became, no, I was not talking partial tongue and brainwashing them. So, yeah, no, I was just using normal hypnosis to brainwash them, but that's a different story.
Out of interest, was the countdown induction the Elman induction, or something different?
It was just a straightforward countdown. I would just try to do it. I called it my lazy science teacher induction for some time, because if you were ever in high school or even middle school and you had those science teachers that would drone on and on in the same tone explaining things like the information was the most important thing, I tried to mimic that, where I would make it slow, I'd make it calm, I'd make it like it just made sense, but I didn't care to put much energy into it, and it just makes you feel tired. The way I figured it out was when I was younger, I used to do the counting sheep to fall asleep. And I found out the more...
You tried to bore them.
Right? The more bored, or the more monotonous it sounds, the less pattern and the less activity the mind has to pick up on, and if it's trying to focus on it, it just feels like it's droning on with it.
You're a terrible person.
I am. It's awful, and it worked so often except for people who were analytical, because then they would just get annoyed.
Yep.
Everyone else would just get comfortable, and they would just be like, this just made me think of when I was in school and I hated listening to teachers. And I was like, there you go, I did it. Success.
Daydreaming now.
I'm still terrible.
Now I can hypnotize you.
Pretty much. Yeah, it's
the daydream-inducing induction.
But no, I think one good point you made earlier, which would be good for us to probably talk on more, is mindscapes or dreamscapes or whatever term the person wants to use. The idea of
another podcast.
Yep, but just touching on it, the idea just the idea that creating that safe space is a way for the mentality to feel like it has a place to return to, especially if it's one that you've created and you can describe as well as they may be able to imagine it, creates that bridge point. The more you can bridge between what they need, want, think, mainly through discussion as we talked about, but through other means, it's amazing how strong and how commonly you can use that. Like, you could use a fireplace crackling in a cabin that you've created for someone. That would be a calming area, calming atmosphere. So if someone's having, say, they are having a panic attack after a scene because they may not feel fully in control, returning them to that point, maybe not putting them into a fully new induction, but instead reminding them of that crackling, reminding them of something relaxing like floating on a pool of water if that's their comfort. It lets their mind have that connection, especially if it's not in control of itself.
Yeah, there are a lot of therapeutic techniques that one can use in aftercare. Not to be...
Mm-hmm.
So the difference between aftercare and therapy is aftercare is for a short period of time, and therapy will deal with something over a very long period of time with the aim to try to reach a point where things have been dealt with in a way that is beneficial for the person in the long run. And unless you're trained to do that and know all the different steps you need to do, that's not something you should offer. However, that doesn't mean you should avoid it, because learning different therapeutic techniques to help give better aftercare can be very, very useful.
Mm-hmm.
So even though within the hypnotic community we tend to say don't offer therapy, that doesn't mean you should avoid it. Absolutely not. Because it can help you give aftercare that you need to give.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I'd say a good mental, just sort of a good way to get a specific outline between the two is, you're right, aftercare is more short term. It can go on, as you mentioned earlier, for if you want to check in with them at certain points, but aftercare is responding to a scenario that either you've both engaged in or one that has happened recently, so you're giving them a direct response to a situation. And by recently, I don't mean within the same day. It could have happened a week ago, a month ago, but it's usually something that has happened recently, and you're caring to them so that they are able to return to some semblance of normality. While therapy itself, if you think about it like this, aftercare is sort of helping to recover, to return, to adjust, maybe not adjust, but to work with the person towards getting back to a point of normality. Therapy is, in and of itself, if you want to use this term, it would be the whole activity. Therapy focuses on bringing the person into an experience that they've had, where you are actually trying to work with them and to help them understand it. And then even in therapy, there is sometimes aftercare. If you break down crying, you have different things where you need to do it. But therapy itself is a full activity where you are helping the person to address and or work through situations that they've been through in the past that may or may not have been recent, and that can be very, very traumatic and or personal. And so understanding that you can learn methods that are used in therapy for the aftercare section and for recovery is good to use in other forms of aftercare, but trying to turn it around where you're using things you know from aftercare to do therapy, especially if you're untrained, can cause more issues, because in a way therapy has a person re-experience original issues and original problems, and if you're not aware of how to deal with the current rather than just the aftercare, it's far more dangerous and disruptive to the person.
As an example, say someone has been taken to, say, a cult, as an extreme example. You bring them back out, you give them a sense of worth, and use aftercare techniques to give them the sense of worth, and they do get it back. But a therapist would also know that the reason that they went into this cult needs to be addressed, because the person also needs to replace that with something less harmful.
Right.
It can still be harmful, just less harmful. And there are other things there as well that I've not mentioned.
Right.
And therapists are trained to take them through all these steps so that they don't go back into a negative experience in the future. And I think it's a bit dark, but one of the things I've seen enough times in the BDSM environment is when things do go bad enough, sometimes people need therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing that that's not something that you can give without training is important too. And it's not a failure on your part if it happens. You can take all the precautions in the world, and things can go wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can be very extreme. It can be a very intense experience. I mean, especially when it comes down to therapy, and we shouldn't talk too much on it, but I'd say, just to give a rough idea, imagine the complexity of the last 10 years of your life and try to sum it up in a 1 hour long explanation. And that is a therapy session. If you can try to imagine all the things you've been through with all the people you know, your career, your school, however old you are, what you've done, try to imagine taking that together and explaining it in an hour. And that is the complexity that you would have to encounter as a therapist just to discuss a session.
And yeah, and having the other side understand it.
Right.
Being able to bring that out of a person in a way that you can process and make useful, and oh god, there's a lot there.
Oh yeah, and the reason I say the last 10 years is because some people here have lived 40, 50 years, some people have lived 15, 20 years, so understanding the complexity of the last 10 years of your life, which are usually the most recent, which automatically it's the most recent, the last 10 years of your life will have the most detail, the most information, the most of what's going on right now in your life, so you'd understand just the complexity of just that. And I think just as a quick touch-up for that cult example, aftercare is helping the person recover from that situation, be able to get back to friends, family, get back on life where you can take care of yourself and you may not be connected to that cult anymore. Versus therapy is sitting down and discussing what happened at that cult and making sense of it and actually creating an understanding as to how that influences who they are as a person on a deeper level, rather than just helping them get back to where they need to be. So much, much more in depth, much, much more personal and trauma focused in some degrees.
And if you're not trained, then don't offer it.
It's good to be a friend who listens. It's good to be someone who's open. If they come to you and they want to talk about it, that's fine. The biggest thing, hypnosis, BDSM, or anything, is to always be able to say that if a situation happens where you're not sure, it's good to say, I don't know. If you're in the middle of the situation, saying, I don't know what to do, accepting that and realizing that at this point, what you do, nothing is going to be perfect. It's not going to be great. What you do is just what you do. Accepting...
It's just the best you can do, yeah.
Right. It's accepting that if you don't know something, admitting it when you're not in a scenario where you need it lets you go and look for the information so you have it. Admitting it when you're in a scenario lets you drop the pressure that you may have on yourself that you're going to do something wrong and realize that what you're going to do is the best thing you can do and just act on what you know and what you have. You know, if someone sits down with you and says they want to talk about trauma and you say that you're open to it, but you don't know therapy, you don't know how to deal with it on a deeper level, they're going to talk with you on a comfortable level. And if they ask you, how do you recover from X? And you say, I don't know, but I can offer this. It gives a very real sense. It gives a very deep connection because it shows that by saying, I don't know something, you're showing where your limits are. And it lets other people see a more real side of yourself because by being, and trust me, I had this for a long time, being Mr. Know-It-All and being how to take care of yourself. I love doing podcasts like this because I can give information I do have. But there are things that I'm still learning even as we talk. Things that I'm realizing, which I may seem more animated about. And there are things I don't know. There are things Puppet Master doesn't know. There are things that everyone doesn't know. I mean, I can say this, I don't know how to birth a horse. That's something that I have a lot of people that know how to do it, but it gives so much more knowledge and experience for how to deal with other parts of life that it's good to say if you don't know it. because it gives people context. It gives people a connection. And it makes you feel less like you have to know everything and more like you're ready to deal with things.
And don't be afraid to ask others for advice or even help. In your definition, Dracoso, of aftercare that you gave, there's one thing in it that I disagreed with. And you said that aftercare comes from the person that was involved in the scene. But we both know that actually aftercare can come from anyone.
True.
So that's
It
important.
can come from any place.
I've had people come to me after a bad experience when they haven't trusted the person that they were playing with to give them aftercare. And I've looked after them. And that's okay. I then had to go at that other person because they were a friend and they were being unsafe and stuff. But that's another story that I probably won't go into in one of these podcasts. Yeah.
No worries, but I think you're right. That it's not that it only comes from one person. It should be able to come from the person who was engaged in the scene, but I think, like I mentioned earlier, if there are other people needed or other people that need to be involved, it's good to know that even if you hit your limits, it doesn't mean that you're limited. It means that you are able to identify and make choices more realistically.
I think the advantage of the aftercare coming from the person who you are in the scene with is that it'll be more immediate on a timescale, and they'll have a better understanding of what went on during the scene itself.
Right.
So that's why a lot of the focus of aftercare is from the person or people that are within the scene. And in BDSM etiquette, it is widely the case that aftercare comes from, and only from, people in the scene and people invited to join aftercare. Because outside of that, people are a lot less aware of what happened, and the connection that people generate within a scene can be very important to readjusting the self back to where they started.
True. Very true.
As can the importance of inviting people in that make you feel safe and secure, the same as the image of a safe place might. So, lots of things to consider. We have certainly not covered everything.
It's another one of those.
But I think we've covered enough for this podcast.
Yep, it's another one of those wide topics. This is just a good place to start. And I think a good point you made earlier, just to continue, is if you do have something you don't know, as Puppet mentioned earlier on, is it's good to ask people who are experienced in that area what they know, what they've experienced, because even if you don't run into the same exact experience, it's good to know what they did, so you'll have a frame of mind for what you could do. So yeah, I think that's a good point for us to say. We hope you've all learned quite a bit, and we hope that this will give some valuable knowledge for the future.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's topic.
If you've enjoyed this, you can support us at patreon.com/braincage. You can also join us over on Discord at Fetlandia and talk with us directly.
Links for both are listed in the description.
Thanks again for listening, and take care.